Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. This is video number 13 in our ongoing series reviewing and refuting Joel Richardson's book, Mystery Babylon, Unlocking the Bible's Greatest Prophetic Mystery. Mr. Richardson takes the position that Babylon of Revelation is none other than Mecca, the capital of the Islamic nation. I've shared with you up to this point some of the major hermeneutical fallacies to be found in this book. He adopts an anachronistic hermeneutic, jumping from first century or even prior events all the way to our present day without any exegetical support, just presumptive and assumptive claims. It really is absolutely disturbing when someone just categorically makes statements without offering any proof. And that's exactly what we find in Mr. Richardson's book. Now, as I mentioned to you, I'm not going to just keep going on and on and on in review of the book. I want to be as kind as possible here, but there is so much error in this book that I could make 50 or more videos in exposing that error. But what I began to do in the last video was to examine Mr. Richardson's claims, his reasons for rejecting Babylon as first century Old Covenant Jerusalem. Now, I want you to take note of something. He admits that AD 70 was a covenantal judgment on Jerusalem. That is so incredibly important. He even admits that it was in fulfillment of Deuteronomy. Well, just a very quick point here. Deuteronomy 32, known as the Song of Moses, foretold the judgment of Jerusalem, Israel, in Israel's last days. Now look, folks, if Israel's last days were in the first century, then they're not future to us. But Deuteronomy chapter 32 foretold God's wrath being poured out on Israel in her last days, in her last end. Deuteronomy 32:19 and following, Deuteronomy 32:29 and following. So if it is the case that AD 70 was in fulfillment of God's covenant wrath in Deuteronomy on Israel, and if it's the case that Deuteronomy foretold the outpouring of covenant wrath on Israel in her last days, at her latter end, last end, and if that judgment was in AD 70, then that is when Israel's last days came to an end. That was her final end. And thus, Mr. Richardson has actually entrapped himself, as he very commonly does in the book, into seeing the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70 as the covenantal judgment on Jerusalem at her final end. Not the beginning of an end, but at her final end, according to Deuteronomy chapter 32. Well, I've got to go on. I want to cover a lot of territory. Now remember, and I am looking at pages 141 and following. And he talks about Jerusalem, and you you really have to catch the power of this, folks. He takes note of the fact that Revelation chapter 11, which is the destruction of the city where the Lord was slain, and he agrees that was talking about Old Covenant Jerusalem. On page 141, quote, preterists are quick to quote Revelation 11:8, where Jerusalem is referred to as Sodom and Egypt. But they consistently ignore just 6 verses earlier, where Jerusalem is called the Holy City. Whatever negative view of backslidden, rebellious Israel we have, we must also acknowledge the Lord's plans and promises to someday restore her. Now, folks, that's reading an awful lot into this. In the Old Testament, yes, Israel or Jerusalem was called the Holy City. She was also called the harlot and doomed to destruction. To extrapolate from that to Revelation chapter 11 and to say that Revelation chapter 11 somehow predicts a future restoration of Jerusalem is completely unwarranted. All it is saying is that this holy city had become the harlot and was about to be destroyed. There is no promise of restoration here. But I have to go on. He makes an argument, and this is on page 143, and in another video I'll get some of the earlier comments. But he says, in Revelation chapter 11, Jerusalem is called the great city. So, he says, by the way, he says, since Revelation 11 posits this great city as where the Lord was slain, that is, of course, Jerusalem. Well, thank you very much. Now watch. Quote, since it is called the great city, in chapter 11, preterists and futurists believe it must also be the great city of chapters 17 to 18. After all, there can be only one great city. Jerusalem must be mystical Babylon, unquote. And then he offers this. Quote, the simple answer to this argument is that throughout the book of Revelation, there are 2 great cities intended to be contrasted. One is the great city of God, and the other is the great city of Satan. Well, I'm sorry, but Mr. Richardson has completely missed the point. He says there are 2 great cities in Revelation. In that regard, he is correct. But wait a minute. Revelation, in his view, must be talking about 3 great cities. That's right. Old Covenant Jerusalem, Revelation 11. Babylon of Revelation 17. Oh, but wait. Then there is the New Jerusalem. The heavenly Jerusalem that is put in stark contrast not to 2 not to 2 other cities, but to one other great city that had become the harlot, the unfaithful bride. Mr. Richardson has created a 3-city narrative. The great city Jerusalem, doomed to destruction, Revelation 11. The great city Babylon, i.e. Mecca, to be destroyed. And then there is the great city of God, the bride, the holy city Jerusalem. Let me reiterate, folks, this is one of those areas. Scholars have long recognized Revelation is about 2 cities. And by the way, it is about 2 women, not 3. It is about 2 mountains, not 3. It is about 2 seeds, not 3. Throughout the entire book of Revelation, just as in Hebrews chapter 12, you have a contrast between 2, not 3. But let me reiterate, in Mr. Richardson's narrative, he has created 3 great cities. Again, let me repeat, he admits Jerusalem is the great city of Revelation 11. Then he switches gears and says there's the great city Babylon of Revelation 17 and 18. The problem here is, among other things, the great city, Revelation 11, and the great city, Revelation 17, did exactly the same specific sins. Killing the prophets, killing the apostles and prophets of Jesus, killing Jesus. Two different cities didn't do that, ladies and gentlemen, and I'll have more to say about that. But nonetheless, you have to see, just have to catch the power of what Mr. Richardson has done. He has created a three-city narrative when there are only two great cities. One is the harlot bride, the harlot wife, who has violated the covenant, Revelation 16. And the glorious new covenant bride, adorned as a bride ready for her husband, coming down from God out of heaven. Not three cities, two cities. And in that narrative of only two cities, Mr. Richardson's book is completely falsified. Now, there's a whole lot more I could say about his admission that Revelation chapter 11 is Jerusalem. And I'll try to get to a lot of that as we continue. In the meantime, don't forget, Mr. Richardson's claim to a great extent is based upon his charge of replacement theology against preterists and other futurists who take Jerusalem as Babylon. And he says the only reason that we take the view that Jerusalem was Babylon is because of the view that Old Covenant Jerusalem, Old Covenant Israel, has been replaced by the church. He says that's the only reason. And so he uses that pejorative term, replacement theology. Look, folks, if you want the most extensive, the most in-depth refutation of the charge of replacement theology, you need to get a copy of my book, One Root, One Kingdom, All Nations. You will see for yourself the very clear, very emphatic, very specific testimony of Scripture that the exclusive ethnic, racial people of Israel were never, ever intended by God to be His exclusive focus. It was always God's purpose, always, to use that single nation, blessed by Him, to bring salvation to all men. That is God's scheme of redemption. Go to my website, donkpreston.com, BibleProphecy.com, order the book, One Root, One Kingdom, All Nations. Send me a note saying you saw the offer on YouTube or Facebook, and I'll refund your shipping. Well, thank you so very much for joining me for this morning's Morning Musings. Hey, don't forget, on Saturday, yes, on Saturday, I'm going to introduce to you a brand spanking new book by Daniel Rogers. You already know about his book on resurrection, 1 Corinthians 15. Well, he's got a brand new one. I'm going to tell you about it in the morning. So we'll see you on the flip side.